They say moving into a new home is a fresh start, but for me, it was the beginning of a living nightmare. I thought I'd found the perfect quiet neighborhood to settle down, but silence can be a mask for something truly depraved. On my second night, a rhythmic scraping under the floorboards woke me up at 2:00 a.m. I thought it was just the house settling, until the smell of rotting meat started coming through the vents. I wasn't alone in that house, and what was happening in my kitchen sink while I slept will haunt me for the rest of my life. Moving is supposed to be a milestone, a chapter of life where you leave the old stress behind and embrace the unknown. I had just purchased a modest 2-story home in a suburban pocket I wasn't entirely familiar with. On paper, it was a dream. The neighborhood was aesthetically pleasing, manicured lawns, mature oak trees lining the streets, and a general sense of suburban tranquility that felt almost too perfect. I had visited the property a few times before closing the deal, and every time the silence of the area struck me. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature, it was a heavy, deliberate stillness. People didn't loiter on their porches. Kids weren't playing in the cul-de-sacs. It was a place where everyone seemed to be holding their breath behind closed curtains. Move-in day was an exhausting blur of cardboard boxes and heavy lifting. Even with a massive moving truck parked out front for 10 hours, not a single neighbor stepped out to offer a wave or a welcome to the block. In my old apartment complex, people were nosy, but here it was as if I was invisible. I didn't mind it at first. I've always been a bit of a recluse myself, but the complete lack of human presence started to feel eerie. It felt like I was moving into a ghost town that just happened to have well-kept gardens. By the second day, the adrenaline of the move had faded, replaced by the daunting task of unpacking. Outside, a thick blanket of snow had begun to fall, turning the world into a monochromatic landscape of white and gray. The cold was biting, pressing against the window panes, forcing me to stay indoors and tackle the mountain of boxes in the living room. I spent the entire day in a cycle of cutting tape and organizing kitchenware, the only sound in the house being the hum of the heater and the occasional gust of wind rattling the shutters. I was exhausted. By 8:00 p.m., my muscles were screaming and my brain was fogged from the repetitive labor. I crawled into bed early, grateful for the plush mattress and the perceived security of my new 4 walls. I drifted off almost instantly, falling into a deep, dreamless sleep. But the house had other plans for me. I jolted awake. There was no transition from sleep to wakefulness. It was a sudden, violent snap. I rolled over and squinted at the digital clock on the nightstand. 2:00 a.m. The house was freezing, the heater seemingly struggling against the plummeting temperatures outside. I lay there for a moment, waiting for my heart rate to settle, wondering what had triggered my internal alarm. Then I heard it. Scrape, thump. It was muffled, coming from somewhere deep within the structure of the house. It wasn't the sharp crack of wood expanding or the whistle of wind in the chimney. It was rhythmic. Scrape, thump. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across a rough surface, followed by a dull, airy impact. It happened again and then again, every few seconds with mechanical precision. My mind raced through logical explanations. A stray branch hitting the siding, an animal in the attic, but the sound was coming from below me, near the foundation. I sat up, the cold air hitting my bare shoulders. The silence in the house between the thumps was deafening. I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to guide me toward the hallway. Every floorboard I stepped on groaned under my weight, sounding like a gunshot in the midnight stillness. I moved toward the stairs, my eyes scanning the shadows that danced on the walls. As I reached the top of the staircase, the sound became clearer. It was coming from the kitchen, scrape, thump. Now that I was closer, it didn't sound like a branch or an animal. It sounded deliberate. It sounded like work being done. I stood at the top of the stairs, paralyzed by a primal fear. I was alone in a new house in a neighborhood where no one would hear me scream, and there was a stranger or something else making noise in my kitchen at 2 a.m. I thought about calling the police right then, but a part of me felt foolish. What would I say? Officer, I hear a scraping sound in my kitchen. They'd think I was just another paranoid new homeowner. I took a shaky breath and started to descend the stairs, one agonizing step at a time. The air in the kitchen felt different, thicker, and carrying a faint, metallic tang that I couldn't quite identify. I reached the bottom and rounded the corner into the kitchen, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, the boxes were still stacked where I had left them, the back door was locked, but the sound, it had stopped the moment my foot hit the kitchen tile. I stood there for what felt like an hour, my ears ringing from the intensity of my listening. Nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator. I checked the locks on the windows and the basement door. Everything was secure. I convinced myself it was just the pipe's old plumbing reacting to the freezing weather. I turned off my light and retreated back to my bedroom, locking my door behind me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for the scraping to return. It didn't, but as the first light of dawn began to gray the edges of my curtains, a new sensation hit me. A smell. It was faint at first, a sickly sweet aroma that reminded me of overripe fruit. But as the minutes passed, it morphed into something much more sinister. It was the unmistakable rancid stench of decaying meat. It wasn't coming from a trash can or a forgotten sandwich. It was coming from the air vents. Something was rotting inside the bones of my house, and the scraping I heard was just the beginning. The sunrise didn't bring the relief I expected. Usually the arrival of daylight dispels the shadows of a restless night, but as the gray morning light filtered through the frosted windows of my new home, it only served to illuminate the grim reality of the situation. The smell was no longer a faint suggestion, it was an aggressive physical presence. It was thick, cloying, and carried the unmistakable scent of organic decay. It felt like it was coating the back of my throat, a heavy mixture of iron and sulfur that made every breath a struggle. I spent the first few hours of the morning frantically checking every inch of the main floor. I moved furniture, tore open the pantry, and even checked the seals on the refrigerator, convinced that a bag of groceries had somehow been misplaced and left to rot in the heat of the furnace. But the kitchen was spotless. The living room was just a sea of half-empty boxes. Every time I leaned close to the floor-to-ceiling air vents, however, the stench doubled in intensity. It was coming from the ventilation system itself, or something deeper. By noon, the psychological toll of the previous night's scrape and thump combined with the worsening odor began to erode my logic. I felt like a prisoner in my own investment. I decided to call a local HVAC technician, hoping it was just a dead raccoon that had crawled into the ductwork to escape the snowstorm. "Yeah, I can get someone out there," the dispatcher said, her voice sounding bored and distant. "But with the snow emergency, it won't be until tomorrow morning at the earliest. We're backed up with heater failures across the county." I hung up feeling a wave of isolation wash over me. I was alone in a house that seemed to be rejecting my presence. I spent the afternoon packing the hallways, my mind looping back to the sounds from 2:00 a.m. If it was just an animal in the vents, why did the sound stop exactly when I entered the kitchen? Why did it sound so rhythmic, so deliberate? Animals are chaotic. What I heard sounded like a process. As evening approached, the temperature outside plummeted even further. The wind began to howl, whipping the snow into whiteout conditions. I realized I wasn't going anywhere. I was trapped here with whatever was beneath me. To keep my mind occupied, I tried to focus on the basement. I hadn't spent much time down there yet. It was a typical unfinished space with concrete walls and exposed pipes. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and descended the wooden stairs. The basement was bone-chillingly cold, much colder than the rest of the house. I scanned the floor for signs of the scraping I'd heard. The concrete was dusty, covered in a thin layer of grime from years of neglect by the previous owners. I followed the line of the air ducts, sniffing the air like a bloodhound. Near the back corner, behind the water heater, I found it. There was a small crawlspace access door, a simple square of plywood held in place by a single latch. I hadn't noticed it during the initial inspection. I leaned in close and the smell hit me like a physical blow. It was coming from in there. I reached out to unlatch the door, my hand trembling, when a sudden loud asterisk clacker sound echoed from the floorboards directly above my head. I jumped back, nearly tripping over a stack of old paint cans. It sounded like someone had dropped a bag of marbles in the kitchen. I stood perfectly still, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the ceiling. Clack, clack, scrape. The sound was back, but it was only 5:00 p.m. It wasn't waiting for the cover of deep night anymore. I bolted back up the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I burst into the kitchen, expecting to see a burglar or a vandal, but the room was exactly as I had left it. Empty, quiet, except for one thing. The kitchen sink. I walked over to the island, my eyes fixed on the stainless steel basin. I had left it clean and dry. Now there was a dark, viscous liquid bubbling up from the drain. It was dark red, almost black, and it carried the concentrated essence of the rot I had been smelling all day. It looked like blood, but thicker, mixed with gray, fleshy bits that didn't belong in a residential plumbing system. I stared at the drain in horror as a small, jagged piece of what looked like bone surfaced in the sludge before being sucked back down into the pipes. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. The scrape and thump I had heard wasn't someone moving furniture. It was someone or something shoving things down into the pipes from somewhere else in the house. The rhythmic thumping was the sound of a plunger or a heavy object being used to force mass through a narrow opening. My house wasn't just old, It was being used as a disposal unit. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but as I looked at the screen, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. My Wi-Fi was down and the signal bar showed no service. The snowstorm had knocked out the local tower, or perhaps something more deliberate was happening. I looked toward the back sliding glass door. The snow was piled high against the tracks, and the woods behind my house were a wall of black and white. Then, through the swirling flakes, I saw a flicker of movement. A tall, dark figure was standing at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still, staring directly at my kitchen window. He wasn't wearing a coat. He was just standing there in the freezing cold, watching me realize what was in my sink. I backed away from the window, retreating into the hallway, my mind screaming. I wasn't the owner of this house. I was an intruder in a space that was already occupied, and whoever was out there had been using this place for a very long time. I ran to my bedroom, locked the door, and pushed my heavy dresser in front of it. I sat on the floor, clutching a kitchen knife, listening to the house. The scraping started again, louder this time, coming from the walls themselves. Scrape, thump, scrape, thump. The smell was becoming unbearable. It felt like the house was breathing on me, exhaling the scent of 1,000 deaths. I realized then that the man outside wasn't trying to get in. He was already in. The figure in the woods was just a distraction. The real nightmare was beneath my feet, working the pipes, filling the house with the rot. The dresser was a heavy oak antique, but as I pressed my back against it, I felt the vibration of the house through the wood. The rhythmic asterisk scrape, thump had evolved. It was no longer just a sound from the basement. It was a physical pulse that seemed to travel up the studs of the walls, vibrating the very floorboards I was sitting on. I looked at the kitchen knife in my hand, a pathetic piece of stainless steel against a nightmare that had clearly been years in the making. I knew I couldn't stay in the bedroom. If the figure in the woods was a distraction and the real threat was working the plumbing, then sitting in a locked room was just waiting for the trap to spring. I needed to know what was in that crawlspace. I needed to know if I was living on top of a graveyard. I pushed the dresser aside, the screech of wood on wood sounding like a scream. I stepped into the hallway, the smell now so potent it felt like a thick, oily film on my skin. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I kept my flashlight low, the beam cutting a narrow path through the freezing air. As I reached the kitchen, I glanced at the sink. The dark sludge had overflowed, spilling onto the white marble countertops. It looked like a living thing slowly creeping toward the edge. I didn't stop to look. I headed straight for the basement door. The air in the basement was even colder than before, the kind of cold that steals the breath from your lungs. My flashlight flickered for a second, a terrifying reminder that batteries are finite. I reached the back corner, past the water heater, and stood before the plywood crawlspace door. The latch was vibrating. Whatever was on the other side was moving with a frantic, desperate energy. I took a deep breath, hooked my finger around the latch, and pulled. The door swung open and a wave of heat hit me, a humid, rotting warmth that was a direct contrast to the freezing basement. I shined the light inside. The crawlspace wasn't just dirt and pipes. It had been excavated. Someone had dug a deeper trench alongside the main sewer line. And then I saw the source of the sound. A heavy, industrial-grade mechanical auger was hooked up to the main cleanout pipe. It was a makeshift setup, powered by a car battery that was humming nearby. The auger was spinning, its metal teeth grinding against something soft and resistant. Scrape, thump. Every time the blades hit a bone or a thick piece of gristle, the machine would buck, creating that airy thump I'd heard from my bedroom. But it wasn't just a machine. Lying in the dirt, surrounded by black plastic heavy-duty trash bags, was a pile of parts. They weren't human, at least I desperately told myself they weren't. They looked like deer carcasses, but they had been stripped of their hide in a way that felt surgical, almost ritualistic. Someone had been bringing these here night after night and using the house's own plumbing to grind them down and wash them into the city's sewer system. Looking for something. The voice was a low, gravelly rasp that came from the darkness behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam hitting a man standing at the base of the stairs. He was the same figure I'd seen in the woods, but now I could see him clearly. He was gaunt, his skin pulled tight over his cheekbones, and he was covered in the same dark, oily sludge that was bubbling up in my sink. He held a long, rusted iron bar in his right hand. "You weren't supposed to move in yet," he said, his eyes reflecting the flashlight beam like an animal. "The listing said vacant for another month. You're ruining the process." "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "What is this?" He didn't answer, he just looked at the auger, then back at me. Do you have any idea how hard it is to hide 100 pounds of meat in a suburban neighborhood? The trash collectors look, the dogs smell, but the pipes just swallow everything. They never ask questions. He took a step toward me, the iron bar scraping against the concrete floor. I've been using this house for years. Every time it goes on the market, I have a few weeks to clear the surplus. You're making this very difficult, neighbor. He lunged. I dived to the side, my shoulder slamming into the water heater. The iron bar whistled through the air, smashing into the plywood crawlspace door with a deafening crack. I didn't think, I just ran. I scrambled up the basement stairs, my socks slipping on the wooden treads. I could hear him behind me, his breathing heavy and wet, the sound of his boots hitting the stairs with a terrifying weight. I burst into the kitchen, the smell of the rot now a physical wall. I didn't even try for the front door. I knew he'd catch me before I could get the deadbolt turned. I ran for the back sliding glass door, the one he had been watching from earlier. I gripped the handle and pulled. It was frozen shut. I looked back. The basement door swung open and the man stepped into the kitchen. He was smiling now, a jagged, yellow-toothed grin that showed he was enjoying the hunt. He raised the iron bar, the sludge dripping from his clothes onto my new hardwood floor. "You're not leaving," he whispered. "You're just going to become part of the surplus." He swung the bar again, catching the edge of the kitchen island. I grabbed a heavy ceramic vase from the counter, a housewarming gift from my mother, and hurled it at his head. It shattered against his forehead, the blue and white shards cutting deep into his skin. He roared in pain, clutching his face. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I grabbed a heavy metal chair and smashed it through the glass of the sliding door. The glass exploded outward into the snow. I jumped through the jagged frame, the shards slicing through my clothes and skin, and landed face first in the freezing white powder of the backyard. I didn't look back. I just ran into the woods, the cold air stinging my lungs, hoping that the snow would hide my tracks as well as the house had hidden its secrets. The snow was no longer a scenic backdrop. It was a freezing, suffocating shroud. I sprinted blindly into the woods, the jagged glass cuts on my arms stinging as the sub-zero air hit them. Behind me, the sound of the man's rage echoed through the shattered sliding door, a guttural, animalistic howl that made my hair stand on end. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have my phone. I only had the adrenaline coursing through my veins and the desperate hope that the blizzard would swallow me before he did. I dove behind a fallen oak tree, burying myself in a drift of snow. I tried to regulate my breathing, but every exhale came out as a thick cloud of white vapor. I watched the house from a distance. The kitchen light was still on, casting a long, rectangular beam across the blood-stained snow where I had landed. The man stepped out of the broken door. He didn't run after me. He stood on the edge of the deck, the iron bar resting on his shoulder. He wiped the blood from his forehead where the vase had struck him, and then he did something that chilled me more than the wind. He began to whistle. It was a cheerful, melodic tune, a sharp contrast to the charnel house he had created inside my home. He stepped off the porch and began to walk, but he wasn't looking for me. He walked toward the back of the property, toward an old, rusted storm cellar door I hadn't even noticed during my walkthrough. He pulled it open, vanished inside for a moment, and then the lights in my house flickered and died. I realized then that he wasn't just a squatter. He knew the veins and arteries of that property better than any blueprint. He wasn't hiding from the world, he was part of the land itself. I stayed in the snow for what felt like hours, my fingers losing sensation, my toes turning into blocks of ice. I knew that if I stayed still, I would die of hypothermia. If I moved, he might hear the crunch of the snow. But then, a miracle appeared on the horizon. A set of high-beam headlights cut through the swirling whiteout on the main road. It was a snowplow. I didn't care about stealth anymore. I lunged out of the snowbank and ran toward the road, screaming at the top of my lungs. The driver saw me, a bloodied, shivering wreck in pajamas, and slammed on the brakes. 10 minutes later, I was in the cab of the truck, wrapped in a heavy wool moving blanket, while the driver called the state police on his radio. When the police arrived at the house, they didn't find the man. The back door was still shattered, the kitchen was still covered in sludge, and the mechanical auger in the crawlspace was still humming, grinding away at the last of its gruesome load. But the man had vanished into the woods as if he were made of the shadows themselves. However, what they found in the storm cellar changed the investigation from a breaking and entering case to something far more dark. The cellar wasn't just a storage space, it was a processing center. They found surgical tools, industrial-grade meat hooks, and most disturbingly, a collection of driver's licenses. My license wasn't there yet, but the license of the previous owner was, and the owner before that. The detective sat me down in the back of an ambulance. The man you saw, he began, rubbing his face with his hands, we think he's the son of the original builder of this neighborhood. He was declared dead in a mental institution fire 20 years ago, but it looks like he never left. He's been moving from house to house as they go on the market, using the vacant periods to dispose of things. What things? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The neighbors, the detective said quietly. You wondered why it was so quiet here, why no one introduced themselves. It's because half the houses on this block are empty. The families didn't move away, they just stopped answering their doors. The animal carcasses the man had been shoving down my drain weren't all animals. The surplus he talked about was the neighborhood itself. He was slowly, methodically cleaning out the cul-de-sac, using the town's own plumbing system to erase the evidence of his work. I never spent another night in that house. I took a massive loss on the sale, but I didn't care. I moved into a high-rise apartment in the city somewhere with a 24-hour doorman and no crawl spaces. Even now, years later, whenever I hear the sink gurgle or a pipe knock in the middle of the night, I freeze. I find myself leaning over the drain, sniffing the air, terrified that I'll catch a whiff of that sickly sweet rot, because I know he's still out there. And somewhere in another quiet, snowy suburb, a for sale sign just went up on a house with a very large, very dark basement.